legitimate.
And in addition to an examination of what's going on internally in Iran, what's driving the politics there, I want to also just go back for a moment to the foreign policy. What's driving U.S. policy? Is it, and we're told that it's support for a democratic opposition as it's characterized in Iran. But when you look at the region, you see the United States supports Mubarak, which is not a democratic government. And the U.S. gives wholehearted support to the Saudi monarchy, which is the negation of democracy, and a theocratic government as well. It appears, I think, to people in the Middle East that whatever the pretext is, whatever the justification or the rationale, underneath it is the issue of control over these vital resources, in particular oil and natural gas, rather than a genuine threat posed by the Iranian government as a consequence of its nuclear program. Do you think that's fair?
I think it's close. I look at it slightly differently. I don't think the United States wants to necessarily have oil resources in the hands of friendly governments or to have control itself, but it wants to be very careful that those vast resources aren't in the hands of hostile governments. That's somewhat different. So that means that we can live with, and I agree, we should not be supporting many of the non-democratic regimes in the Middle East, but as long as the governments aren't hostile to us, we're tolerant of them. So it isn't that they have to be necessarily bosom buddies, but it's worrisome when they're actively hostile. And we also have to remember that one reason I think that Iran, in a sense, it's an appeal because Iran is a very complex society. They have a strong domestic movement toward a responsible democracy. There's a lot of potential in Iran, and I think that people see that there's this potential in Iran that they perhaps do not see in other countries, like in Saudi Arabia. I don't think that people are thinking that there's going to be a democratic revolution in Saudi Arabia tomorrow.
Yeah. Ray, as a former CIA analyst, knowing someone very familiar with CIA tactics, it was obvious that when the Green Movement, so-called Green Movement, started up in Iran, after the election, that the United States government very much supported that movement. In other words, even recently, Hillary Clinton, as Secretary of State of the United States, said it was troubling or regrettable that a demonstration, an anti-government demonstration, was canceled in Iran. In other words, doesn't it appear again that the United States, not because of democracy so much, or purported democracy, but for its own interest, is using different methods, either military methods or economic sanctions, which are now U.S. government just passed draconian economic sanctions, or destabilization through mass movements, if they arise, to overthrow the government for other objectives. I mean, even during the time of when Mossadegh was in power, the sanctions imposed at that time by the British and the United States did create a middle-class mass movement against Mossadegh that became, in a way, the human material for the Shah's coup. No?
No. It was all manufactured. In those days, the British Secret Service and the CIA could do those kinds of things right readily. We used to call it overthrowing governments. Now we call it regime change. That's interesting. One thing I'd like to pick up on here, which is really essential, an erroneous statement by one of the interviewees, Israel is our ally. And you mentioned that someone else was our ally, Saudi Arabia. Neither Saudi Arabia nor Israel are our ally. If you look it up in Webster's, to be an ally of another country, you need a mutual defense agreement, a treaty. And there is none between the U.S. and Israel or Saudi Arabia. Now, the interesting story is that after the the oil embargo back in the 70s, we went to the Israelis sort of very quietly and said, look, you know, we don't like the notion that the Arabs feel that they can attack you as they did in 73. So what would you think of an alliance? What would you think of a treaty? The Israelis said, well, thanks very much, but no thanks. Okay? Now, why did they say that? Because a treaty requires internationally recognized boundaries. The Israelis in 1967 conquered the West Bank, Sinai, Gaza. They did that deliberately, and they're not going to give it up. Even though we, the United States, very atypically voted for the UN resolution in 1967, which said Israel must withdraw from the occupied territories. Now, Israel has been occupying those territories for longer than the Soviet Union occupied Eastern Europe. So that's the bone of contention there. The Israelis are going to stay there, and they don't think they need any mutual defense treaty because everyone thinks, and Congress says, and even our president refers to Israel as our ally. If Israel is our ally, then a mutual defense treaty has no significance because there is none between Israel and the United States. That's important to me.
But the United States does give Israel something in the range of $15 million per day. And the U.S. government just signed a contract, a deal to give $30 billion in military armaments to Israel for the next 10 years. That obviously will cement a U.S. Israeli military relationship. Does that, in your opinion, Ivan, stop the United States from saying Israel is illegally possessing nuclear weapons, Israel refuses to sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty? In other words, overlook all these obvious legal problems with Israel's conduct regarding nuclear weapons because the American government may see the Israelis as an extension of American power in this region? Well,
you used the word cement. I don't think there's any cementing that needs to be done. There's close ties already with Israel and the United States, and I don't, we might have occasional conflicts, but I see that continuing for the indefinite future. I think that the issue here, you want to make this link between Israel's nuclear program and Iran. The fact is that I agree. I wish that Israel were more open about its nuclear program. I would like to see the elimination of all nuclear weapons. I work a great deal in trying to reduce U.S. and Russian nuclear weapons. I'm very concerned about Pakistan and India, but the fact is that if the Iranians think that we're going to solve all the problems before we can solve any problem, then we'll never solve any problem. There is a problem with the world seems to think that there is a problem with Iran's nuclear program, and maybe it isn't fair that Israel is getting off free, but we need to. You can't say we have to solve the Israeli-Palestinian question before we can.
Well, Ray McGovern asserts that the United States is really, the real goal is to carry out regime change in Iran. In other words, to overthrow the government and go back to a situation like they had in the 50s, 60s, and 70s when there was a virtual proxy government with the Shah. We only have a few seconds left, so give me a 20-second answer. Do you think the U.S. goal really is to carry out regime change in Iran?
I think that the U.S. goal is to have a free election in Iran.
So,
which would result in a regime change, I believe.
So, Ray McGovern, the Iranian government says that there was a free election, that there were monitors, that while there's an opposition, that they are a democracy. Is that what's driving U.S. policy towards Iran? You have 20 seconds.
There was corruption. There was that kind of thing during the Iranian election. But Ahmadinejad won fair and square. Get over it. This is a legend that's been spread, that it's a disputed election. It's not as disputed as the election that brought George Bush to power. So, one has to look at the real polls.
I think you're going to have the last word. We'll see how it develops. Of course, you can see people on the street in Washington are paying attention as they should. This concludes this episode of American Dream. I'm Brian Becker. We'll see you next week.